What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, week 15 wide receiver starts and sits, and that's right, no bye weeks anymore. Winner of this game goes to the championship. So I can't stress enough exactly how important it is to hit on these wide receiver starts and sits, let alone every start and sit this week. So we have completely released our website for free. That's thefantasyfootballadvice.com. So if you're struggling with who exactly to start, check out our rankings. There's additional content released for free on there as well. So again, that's thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link for that, as always, in the description box below. We do have a lot of matchups to go over, so we are going to hop right into it. The first matchup we have is Baltimore Ravens versus the New York Jets, and it's a very one-sided match. It does have a 45.5 point projected total, but Baltimore is expected to win by 14.5 points. Typically, that would indicate a positive passing game script for the Jets, which would benefit Jamison Crowder, Robbie Anderson, but it still is one of the tougher matchups for them, at least that they faced recently. So Anderson's not going to be as high in the rankings. However, he is a premier flex option. We do prefer Anderson over Jamison Crowder, and Demaryius Thomas, while he did score last week, he's not on our radar for any sort of flex consideration. For Baltimore, Marquise Brown is going to be a flex option, one with a high floor and a low ceiling. In a high projected total, he has a good shot to score. However, you're likely going to need that touchdown to pay off the start, and he hasn't been putting it together consistently enough for us to trust him 100%. Mark Andrews is the only other receiver for the Baltimore side that we're really interested in starting, and we did drop him significantly since he is a little bit banged up at this point. Due to the thin position, you could obviously start him. There's just going to be a little bit more risk than there would be in previous matchups. On to the Sunday slate, we have the New England Patriots versus the Cincinnati Bengals, and when talking about the Bengals, we do have to drop the receivers because this is the Patriots pass defense we're talking about. Tyler Boyd, due to volume and his role in the offense, is still going to be inside the top 30. We do have to temper our expectations quite a bit, but if you own him, he's still a decent flex option. Auden Tate, we're not interested in. John Ross as well. And on the Patriots side, it's super simple. We're only starting Julian Edelman and no other receiver for the Patriots outside of him. As for Edelman though, a mid-grade wide receiver one who gets even more of a boost in full PPR leagues. Tampa Bay versus Detroit, and typically we would be really excited about the receivers in this matchup, but as you all may know, Mike Evans and Marvin Jones are out for the season. It is going to boost the production, the target volume that is expected to come for players like Chris Godwin as well as Kenny Golladay, who both are inside the top 10 this week. But for Tampa Bay, look for other receivers to try to take place of that production. Brashad Perriman, we saw him score last week. OJ Howard is also an option. Justin Watson. We're not really comfortable starting any of those players. Just keep an eye out for them. Danny Amendola could see an uptick in targets. However, we don't want to feel confident starting him this week, so we don't even have him ranked as a flex. Philadelphia versus Washington, and at this point, all of the Philadelphia receivers seem to be banged up. You have Alshon Jeffrey, who's already been ruled out. Nelson Aguilar, whose status is claimed to be up in the air at this point, and even if he does start, it's not like we can recommend starting him as anything more than a dart throw, but it would boost the tight end position, that being Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert, both of which would see heavy usage, especially if both of those receivers were out. So outside of the tight end position, we're really not interested in any of the wide receivers on this team, even in a good matchup. Terry McLaurin on the Washington side is likely going to be the high scoring fantasy receiver in this game. It's still going to be a little tough to trust him because of Dwayne Haskins' inconsistencies, and with the fact that even in a solid performance last week, he only had 7 targets. In 2 out of 3 of the games before that, he had a combined 8 targets, but it's still a great matchup. So if you do have him on your roster, he is going to be outside of a wide receiver 2 ranking, but he is going to be a high-end flex this week and one you can feel confident starting. Up next, we have the Bears versus the Packers. It has a low projected total at just 40.5 points. The Packers are home favorites in this one. Expect a good game for Devontae Adams. The Bears defense, yes, they're scary and they're becoming more healthy as we speak, but Devontae Adams, he's been on an absolute tear, getting double-digit targets 5 of the last 6 games, his last game being the worst performance of the bunch. Expect him to bounce back though. The Chicago Bears themselves have been giving up a ton of fantasy points to the wide receiver position lately, including games against Dallas, Detroit, and New York Giants. So Devontae Adams should have no problem getting it done this week, so we're going to start him as a top 5 option and no other Green Bay receiver outside of him. For Chicago, there are 2 receivers that are in consideration this week. Allen Robinson, the obvious one. The last time they faced, he had 13 targets, 7 receptions for 102 yards, and that's the type of upside he's going to have in this matchup as well, and also have a chance to score. The other wide receiver I was mentioning is going to be Anthony Miller. We do have Miller ranked this week as a viable flex option on the lower tier of the flex options, but one you could certainly put in. Just keep in mind, Green Bay's pass defense has been looking solid against lower tier pass offenses, and that's what we would classify Chicago. Moving into a matchup that should have a decent amount of fantasy production from the receiver position, we have the Houston Texans versus the Tennessee Titans. It's a 50 projected total, which is one of the highest on the entire week. Tennessee is at home and favored by 3. Good spot for DeAndre Hopkins, but you don't need me to tell you to start him. It's unclear if Will Fuller is going to be playing this week. He was not active last week. If he does, it's a great spot for him. He would probably be ranked somewhere as a wide receiver 3, one with a bit of volatility, but the upside would 100% be there in a game with a 50 projected total. Kenny Stills would be the heir apparent to his targets. However, he did only get 2 targets last week. That was in a much tougher matchup against Denver. However, even in a softer matchup with a high projected total, we do have to temper expectations and can't lock him in, but he is still someone who you could consider in the flex spot if you were desperate. Just keep in mind we don't have him ranked inside the top 40. If you've seen our rankings though, the ranking that might surprise most people is our ranking of AJ Brown. We do have him ranked as a wide receiver 2 this week, so one you could start with confidence, and the upside is certainly there. He scored in 2 of the last 3 games, and even on a measly 7 targets last week, he turned that into 153 yards for 2 touchdowns. Against the poorest pass defense of the Houston Texans, a similar type of performance is definitely in the range of outcomes for AJ Brown this week. No other receiver in this game we're considering starting, so we're hopping into the next one. Broncos versus Chiefs, and Courtland Sutton finds himself in a really good spot this week against a team which you know is going to force the pass late. Kansas City Chiefs, they're home, they're 9.5 point favorites, and they're not going to let their foot off the gas pedal because there is still an outside chance that they could clinch home playoffs. So expect a positive game script for Courtland Sutton, who we have ranked as wide receiver 18. Tyreek Hill, we still do have him ranked as a top 5 option. There is going to be some uphill battles for him this week. It's not an extremely easy matchup. Patrick Mahomes' hand did also get injured last week, but his 6 for 62 stat line against New England is pretty respectable, and he could certainly do more damage in this contest this week. Sammy Watkins, he's going to be a bench, and then you have Travis Kelce, who's battling George Kittle for that tight end 1 spot in the rankings. New York Giants versus Miami Dolphins, and this is a really good spot for the Giants receivers. It was a good spot last week for outside receivers. However, Eli Manning looked like absolute trash outside of 1 quarter. So although the performances of these receivers in a good matchup last week disappointed, we are still willing to start them against the Miami Dolphins. Sterling Shepard, high-end wide receiver 3. Slayton is on the cusp of being a flex type starter, and Golden Tate himself is a flex worthy starter this week. For Miami, Devontae Parker did get injured and left last game after totaling 2 receptions for 28 yards. It's a concussion, so he will have to clear protocol in order to play. If he does, he's going to be a wide receiver 2 in this slate. If he doesn't start, we're not really interested in putting the others into our lineups. However, there will be some upside for those players as well. Seattle versus Carolina, and we really like this spot for DJ Moore. We bumped him up in the rankings. He's now a mid-grade wide receiver 1. Seattle has been extremely susceptible to getting beat through the air, and their offense has been known to put up enough points to keep the passing game a factor throughout all 4 quarters. For Seattle, Tyler Lockett, disappointed yet again. A boom bust, high-end wide receiver 3 is really where we have to have him ranked this week. It's a tough passing defense, that being Carolina, and the production simply hasn't been there for several weeks at this point. DK Metcalf, we do still have ranked below him. However, his usage in the red zone is more promising, so starting him as a high-end flex or wide receiver 3 is completely acceptable in this contest. We're not starting Josh Gordon. Jacob Hollister at the tight end position is somebody that you could put in as a back-end tight end 1. The volume, he's had 6 targets and 8 targets the past 2 weeks, which for the tight end position, that's enough to get it done. Again, not a great matchup, so he is going to be a back-end tight end 1, but one that should have a relatively safe floor. Jacksonville Jaguars versus the Oakland Raiders, and this would be a great spot for the Jacksonville receivers. Unfortunately, DJ Chark is week to week right now, so don't expect him to suit up, but that would be a boost for DD Westbrook. Westbrook we do have ranked inside the top 30. It's a great matchup. The Oakland Raiders pass defense is poor, especially compared to their run defense, so expect them to rely on the passing game, even though they are banged up at that position. A bit of the opposite could be said towards Jacksonville. Their pass defense is better than their rush defense. So a player like Tyrell Williams, we're not expected to have a boom type performance. However, he does always bring that to the table. We do have him ranked as a boomer bust flex play this week, so starting him with those expectations is fair. Darren Waller, however, he's going to be the man that you should be trusting in your lineup and fitting into your lineup if you own him on your roster. No receivers outside of the ones listed we are interested in starting this week, so we're going to jump into the next one. Browns versus the Cardinals, and we got to ride with Jarvis Landry ahead of Odell Beckham this week. We do have Landry ranked as a high-end wide receiver 2 as opposed to Odell Beckham's mid-grade wide receiver 2 because it still is a really good matchup. The Arizona Cardinals, they are easily beat through the air, so it's not going to be uncommon for both of these receivers to have good games. However, if you are drawing a line through the sand, Jarvis Landry is the receiver that we would take. On the other side of the ball, it's Christian Kirk or nobody else. Last week wasn't a great matchup, and he still was able to compile 8 receptions for 85 yards on 9 targets, so very efficient. So a back-end wide receiver 2 performance from him, that's where we're going to have him ranked. Vikings versus Chargers, and while typically we had Stephon Diggs ranked as a wide receiver 1 in the absence of Adam Thielen, this week though he is going to be a high-end wide receiver 2 because it's a little more difficult of a matchup. Still has plenty of upside. He will be the main receiving target in this passing game, just one that could be more capped than it had been in previous contests. On the other side of the ball, we have Mike Williams and Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen should be primed for a big performance. Just be mindful of the fact that he has only had 6 targets in each of the last 2 contests, which does have a bit of volatility. However, his targets do have a high conversion rate, and we have seen him used in the red zone recently, so that does bode better for his potential upside. We do have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 1, and as for Mike Williams, he had his first touchdown last week. He had over 100 yards the week before. He is a viable flex play in this matchup. Just be wary, it's Mike Williams. He definitely has a dud in his repertoire, but all signs point to him being a viable flex play this week. Hunter Henry is an auto start, so no need to go any further into him. Rams versus Dallas, and we're finding these Dallas receivers in a really good spot for week 15. Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup are both going to be fine starts above where their typical ranks have been recently. Amari Cooper, high-end wide receiver 2. Michael Gallup, mid to low-end wide receiver 2. So needless to say, if you have them, put them both in there. Feel pretty confident about it as well. On the other side of the ball, we can't quite say the same. Cooper Kupp's still going to be ranked as a wide receiver 1, but this is against Dallas. They don't make many mistakes. They're pretty tight to opposing fantasy receivers. And for Cooper Kupp, coming off of a combined 10 targets the past 2 weeks, although he's been efficient catching all 10 of them and scoring 2 touchdowns, 1 in each of the last 2 contests, it is still going to be a start in which does carry a little bit of risk to disappoint you. However, there's no way you could reasonably not start him over your other options. For Robert Woods, he is way too hot to sit this week. He has had no less than 95 yards since week 8. So put him in as a high floor option for you. We're also ranking Woods as a mid to high end wide receiver 2. The last player we're mentioning is Tyler Higbee, who at the tight end position is going to be a start this week. He sent me home in one of my leagues, so if you have him, start him as a mid TE1 for this matchup, but no other receiver outside of that we should be interested in fitting into our lineups. 49ers versus the Falcons, and Calvin Ridley is likely going to miss the remainder of the season, which in this one matchup should mean a higher projected target market share for Julio Jones, but it will overall hurt this offense and their ability to move the ball down the field. Against San Francisco, we weren't expecting him to have a huge offensive performance, so Julio Jones isn't going to be ranked extremely high this week. We do have him as a mid to back end wide receiver 1 just due to talent and the projected amount of targets he's going to receive this week, but expect for Austin Hooper to be the main guy outside of Julio. There is still Russell Gage, who has shown that he can perform if his number's called, but we're not starting him this week. It's a tough matchup, and even in a good matchup, it still has its risks. For San Francisco, the opposite is true. We have a great matchup for these receivers. Emmanuel Sanders caught 7 of 9 targets for 157 yards and a touchdown last week. We have him ranked as wide receiver 20, and Deebo Samuel right behind him at wide receiver 23. Both back end wide receiver 2s and ones with plenty of upside at that. And George Kittle, we do have him ranked squarely as the top fantasy option at the tight end position this week. Pittsburgh Steelers versus Buffalo Bills, and not a ton to get excited about on either side of the football. It's got an extremely low projected total at just 36.5 points, and for Pittsburgh, they don't really have any receiving weapons. You have James Washington, who has been solid from the outside, but the volume hasn't been enough to sustain consistent fantasy production, and he finds himself in one of the worst matchups for outside wide receivers this week. Starting him as a flex play is acceptable, just one with an extremely low floor, and don't get cute and start any other Pittsburgh Steelers receiver outside of that. On the other side of the ball, we do have two receivers worth mentioning, Cole Beasley and John Brown. Beasley is a viable flex option this week. Just keep in mind that the Pittsburgh Steelers pass defense is on the better side of receiving defenses while he's been on his hot streak, so just keep that in mind. John Brown, though, we do have him ranked as a high-end wide receiver 3, back-end wide receiver 2. Just touching back again, it is a tougher pass defense this week. The final matchup we have is the Indianapolis Colts versus the New Orleans Saints. Starting with the Saints, it's pretty simple. We're starting Michael Thomas. Regardless of matchup, he's going to perform. Jared Cook, he's an option at the tight end position you could start as well. We have him as a mid to back end tight end 1. And on the other side of the ball, T.Y. Hilton is still week to week, so expect to be without him. So what's left is Zach Pascal and Jack Doyle. Jack Doyle is going to be a mid TE1 just due to his volume, and Zach Pascal is going to be one of the higher upside flex options this week. But guys, that's going to do it. We went through every matchup. If you're still unsure who to start, we can't stress enough, utilize the rankings available on our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link for that, as always, in the description box below. If you did enjoy this video, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.